Good evening, everyone. Good evening. And thank you all so much for coming. We have a full house tonight, as you might have seen, which is a wonderful way for us to start our fall program. I'd also like to welcome our online audience. I know that you are out there from Bucharest, Romania to Boulder, Colorado. So whether it's daytime or nighttime, thank you very much for joining us. My name is Bartley Grosser-Richter. I'm the current president of the Yale Club of Germany and the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy, which is a cooperation between the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's wonderful amerikahaus. So while we're here to talk about the threats we face online and how social media and algorithms have unleashed information warfare on our societies, and how online extremists have used the platforms to literally break us, according to one of our guests, another theme we have tonight is gratitude, and I'd really like to open with that. As you know, we have a dinner reception tonight for our member donors as a thank you for supporting us and for helping to make this community what it is. All of our events here are puzzles. We work with different partners and different groups in order to bring you what we hope are world-class evenings. So between our hosts here at amerikahaus, the Yale Club of Germany, Yale University, we work with other alumni clubs, we work with publishing houses, other international groups like the John Adams Institute in Amsterdam, which is how we got Renee tonight. So we try to offer wonderful evenings through our partnerships. And tonight's panel is one of those puzzles, and a world-class evening it is. It's a cooperation with Bard College Berlin and their fall event series, Writing Democracy, Stories, Ideas, and Arguments on and Off the Page. The series brings prominent journalists and writers to a wider Berlin and German audience, hence Munich tonight, to discuss topics of civic and political interest in both Germany and the United States. This program is possible through the generous support of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, so we'd like to start by saying a very warm thank you to the Heinrich Böll Foundation for supporting this program and for joining us from Washington, D.C. tonight. Thank you. And in Munich, the Melior Foundation has been very generous, promoting transatlantic understanding and in supporting our program over the past couple of years, and a very warm thank you to you as well. So our topic tonight is poisoned politics, truth, lies, and the decline of discourse and democracy. Light stuff. I was at an event for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence last Monday. I know some of you were there. We saw each other. It was a bit dark, wasn't it? Even Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of Atlantic magazine, wondered out loud if democracies would be able to survive social media. And a study came out this week confirming to what extent social media algorithms have steadily increased the relative amount of political and strong negative sentiment content on the algorithms that we all receive since 2010. It's been a flip from neutral to that. And then on Tuesday, the United States went to the polls and delivered a resounding pro-democracy message. Which maybe will add a bit of lightness to our evening tonight, but we'll see. But even there, social media was front and center as well. New York City's mayor-elect Zoran Mamdani, in his acceptance speech, took on the problem of disinformation in modern politics, noting that, quote, "Many have heard our message only through the prism of misinformation. Tens of millions of dollars have been spent to redefine reality and to convince our neighbors that this new age is something that should frighten them. They want the people to fight amongst ourselves so that we remain distracted from the work of remaking a long broken system." Now, whether or not you agree with his politics, what we can all agree on is that in today's online world, if you make it trend, you make it true, and truth has become fake news. So returning tonight for a third time with us is Joshua Jaffa, a Munich Dialogues favorite, a staff writer at The New Yorker. I said, we're going to have to get jackets, right? A staff writer at The New Yorker, and he is Bard College Berlin's inaugural writer-in-residence. So Josh will be moderating the conversation with our distinguished guests tonight. Renée DiResta is Associate Research Professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. She's the author of Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. One reviewer wrote that it will open your eyes to the nature of a game most of us don't even realize we're playing. She's a contributing editor at Lawfare and also contributes to The Atlantic and has a story coming out next week. Hopefully tomorrow. There you go. She was previously the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She's analyzed geopolitical influence operations run by foreign powers, as well as propaganda, rumors, and conspiracy theories. She's advised Congress, the White House, state legislatures, and business organizations on issues related to tech and policy, including generative AI, election security, researcher transparency, and even child safety. Her story starts as a vaccine activist. Andrew Marantz is Josh's colleague, a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he's been since 2011. He's the author of the 2019 book, Antisocial, How Online Extremists Broke America. It was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, and many other. And I can second the reviewer who wrote, everything in it is in a nightmare, and you can't put it down. His work has also appeared in Harper's, New York, Mother Jones, the New York Times. You have heard him on the New Yorker Radio Hour. He has spoken at TED. You might have seen him on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and many other outlets. So we will be using Slido.com tonight to do your questions. Hopefully we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. If you're here, you can just, hopefully the QR code will come up and you can use your phone, which is on silent, I hope. And you can send us questions. And if you're at home, go to Slido.com, hashtag amerikahaus, spelled with a K-H-A-U-S, and send your questions that way. So with that, I'll turn the microphone over to you, Josh. Welcome to Munich.
Thanks, Bartley, for the wonderful introduction, to you and amerikahaus for hosting us, and to all of you for coming. Wonderful to see such a large crowd, though that may be a testament to how freaked out we're all feeling. I can't promise you'll feel less freaked out by the end of the evening, but let's see what you both have to tell us. I want to return to the world of your books. Andrew's came out in 2019, yours, Renée, just last year, 2024. But it feels to me like a lot's happened since then. And both of you study or write about online worlds, how information is generated, disseminated, algorithmically spread, influence other parts of both the media ecosystem, society at large. And I want to ask both of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Renée, first, and the triad of influencers, algorithms, and crowds that you write about, how a dynamic that you describe happening in an online environment seems to me to have kind of escaped the laboratory. We're all kind of living that way now, right? There's a kind of collapse of the online and offline, and the dynamics that you write about, which feel or potentially have quite worrying stakes when they were contained to an online world. What does it mean, if you agree with the thesis, and perhaps you could respond to it or explain how you see it in terms of how society, relations between people, doesn't even matter only on political issues, on all sorts of issues have come to kind of take on or borrow from or kind of replicate the dynamics you saw that you were writing about in an online context.
Sure. So thank you for the question. It's great to see everybody here. I think, so I read Andrew's book when it came out, and some of the characters in his book figure in mine as well. And when they were in his book, at the time he was writing about them, they had maybe tens of thousands of followers. And by the time they were in mine, they had millions. And this was one of the things I pointed out. And I think I actually cited yours in mine. Kind of explaining that, that people who were kind of transparently telling lies, right? The guy who made up the story of Pizzagate, for example, was really instrumental in working with online crowds to create this fantasy, this conspiracy theory that there were children being held hostage in the basement of a pizza place in Washington, D.C. by elites in the Democratic Party. Complete nonsense conspiracy theory. Went from having tens of thousands of Twitter followers when Andrew was writing about him to millions of followers now. And he's a leading political figure in American politics, regularly welcomed into the White House. Right? So these figures have gotten more powerful, not less. The crowds that they engage with are significantly more adept at creating momentum around the sorts of ideas that they want to spread. And what we see now, and what I've been writing about quite a bit in the Atlantic and Lawfare and other places, is that these things now translate directly into policy. And so there is no break between online and offline. In my personal opinion, as an extremely online person for my entire life, really, but definitely the better part of the last 15 years, the idea of online and offline being separate is sort of foreign to me, right? So much of public opinion is shaped by people you maybe have never heard of if you're not online, but they really are shaping the ways in which we talk about ideas. They're shaping the ways in which politicians think about ideas. And now we're seeing the very direct connection between what the online crowd talks about and what politicians go and do. I'll give a very quick example, which is the dismantling of USAID. All right, so international crowd here. We know that the U.S. Agency for International Development. Now, there had been calls in the Republican Party to dismantle this agency. It was not a well-liked agency in the Republican Party, but what you saw was a lot of calls to dismantle it with kind of explicitly conspiratorial allegations about specific grants that it made, about purported ties to the CIA. There was it kind of became a meme in the United States, $50 million in condoms for Hamas, right, which was a misreading of a line item for AIDS prophylactics in Africa. It had nothing to do with Hamas, it wasn't $50 million. But this sort of online meme, and then Elon Musk says, we're looking at it, we're dealing with it, and then all of a sudden these sort of, the immediate next thing is like, it's dead, the grant is killed, this is all part of Doge, the agency is dead, we spent the afternoon feeding it into the wood chipper, and then you see the agency dismantled within 2 weeks, right? So the process happens so quickly now, and yes, there is some component of the entities and policy using the online narrative to do the thing they already wanted to do, but you're seeing this handoff happen extraordinarily quickly, and that is the piece where I say, like, there is no gap between online and offline, and I think that it's really critical that people understand that, because this is happening all over the world now. This is where policy is going.
You mentioned building your own work off of Andrew's and some characters that appeared in his book, and I want to ask you, Andrew, about the degree to which people you were writing about 5 years ago, more at this point, who seemed to be, they represented something important, yet they were at the fringe, right? They were kind of harbingers, and maybe you essentially kind of had a premonition that proved darkly correct. But you were writing about people who were, maybe to many of your readers, potentially hearing about them for the first time. They weren't kind of setting the mainstream political discourse, but they're important in some way. And now, some of the people in your book, you told me a story as we were walking in about how Nick Fuentes, a figure now capturing a lot of attention, and perhaps you can explain who he is and why he matters, was someone that actually was too marginal, too fringe for you to even consider as a character. He seemed kind of outside the bounds of even this fringe world you were writing about 5 or so years ago. And explain both how it sort of feels as a writer, right, to be in this universe and to watch the goalposts change so dramatically, but more importantly, kind of what that means, you think, for politics and culture.
Yeah, I mean, we go out looking for stories, and they're nonfiction stories, and we want them to be true, and we want them to mean something, but, I didn't go out with a kind of mandate of, like, who is setting the discourse from the top down. I was more interested in the kind of ecosystem level from these kind of, as you say, fringe purveyors of either false things or noxious things to these kind of middle kind of connective tissue purveyors to how they reach the mainstream. And so it was kind of the full picture that I was after. And it was, it's funny when you were talking about a book about the internet that came out in 2019, I was thinking, like, yeah, a lot has happened since then. It's kind of silly to, even keep a book like that on paper to some extent, and yet everyone in the book either represents something that we're dealing with now or is just the person that we're dealing with now. So, you have the Pizzagate guy who is, as you say, in the White House all the time doing roundtables about how Antifa is a terrorist organization. You have I mean, another character in my book, Laura Loomer, who, again, was someone who I spent a lot of time with. We took a lot of road trips together. She has really, I have to say, like, no filter about having reporters around, so she would just let me hang out all the time. And it was just kind of almost, I had to wrestle with myself, like, am I not so much platforming this person, but am I legitimizing, you know, yes, I'm going to be saying very fair but mean things about her in print, but yet her name is going to show up in that New Yorker typeface, and what if she gets a little thrill out of that? What is my ethical responsibility? And now that seems so quaint to have to wrestle with that. I mean, Laura Loomer now walks into the Oval Office and tells Donald Trump who to hire and fire, and he does it. And if you, like, I could tell you things about what this person's worldview is that would make that a very shocking statement. So, and Nick Fuentes, to your point, yeah, he was so marginal at that time that, you know, I mentioned him once or twice, but he wasn't setting any kind of agenda. There's a kind of, you know, we can get into this, but the way that these kind of amplification networks work, and I think we all have a kind of intuitive sense of this, right, is that you don't have a kind of, it's not the kind of old entertainment model where you have, like, you know, some record executive being like, the song of the summer is going to be this, right? That's not kind of how, nor is it like the front page of a newspaper where you have a bunch of editors. You have, as we all know, these algorithmic filters, and there are many different kinds, and there are editorial and curatorial decisions that are being made within that, but there's a kind of, this is why the ecosystem analogy is useful. There are people who kind of peddle things, and they have different layers and different jobs within that. Fuentes was, I mean, he says things that are literally illegal to say in this country. He's a Holocaust denier, he's, you know, a kind of a neo-Nazi, and so I kind of felt like my audience gets that. They understand what a neo-Nazi is. I didn't really have to, it wasn't very narratively rich to explain, and it's kind of, you know, narratively not that novel, and yet we're now in a situation where I would say the must-see television event of the last week was Tucker Carlson doing a 2.5-hour sit-down interview with Nick Fuentes, and they were really battling kind of over who is the kind of standard bearer of the American conservative movement now, and it's really up for grabs. And so you have this kind of progression through the ecosystem that is never static, and it's not only, you mentioned something about hope or not freaking people out too much. I'm not going to do much of that, so just set your expectations low, but it doesn't only go in an inexorably more Nazi direction. Like, it doesn't, there's no law of the internet. It sometimes feels that way, but there's no law of the internet that everything must always get more noxious and untrue. But there's no law that says it won't. And so it's kind of a Darwinian struggle in tooth and claw, and this is where we are.
Mm-hmm. And both of you, whoever wants to start with this, can, in terms of driving kind of who rises within that ecosystem, the personalities, the arguments, the ideas, you know, where do you see the distinction between a technical component? Renee, in your book, right, one of the pillars of the triad are the algorithms, right? You also need the influencers and the crowds, but like there is a kind of, I'll call it a technical component, if that's the word you would agree with, that is playing some determinative role in terms of who rises and falls in that ecosystem. But there's also a whole lot, and you or Andrew can speak to this, you know, none of that can work without there being the kind of social context, people's kind of actual lives, their economic lives, their personal lives, the way they experience reality, like that the algorithm, it's like, you know, good propaganda, right? Good propaganda only works or best works when it's actually in some kind of dialogue with your own lived experience and sort of resonates with what you, if not know to be true, kind of believe to be true or want to believe to be true. So talk about this distinction between the technical and actually just the kind of social or political.
Well, I think a good political influencer is a fantastic propagandist, and I don't shy away from that. I think that that's actually how you should be thinking about it. That is what they are doing. If they are good at their job, so to speak, and they are getting paid for this most of the time, they're very effective at it. Nick Fuentes has an audience because Nick Fuentes is entertaining, and that is a thing that I think people don't want to hear. They don't want to reckon with it. Nick Fuentes is funny, and that's the other thing that people don't want to hear and don't want to reckon with. Nick Fuentes' content gets clipped by people, and it goes viral outside of his community because not the Holocaust denial, not the most egregious content, but the other stuff that he says. The parts where he's just sort of lampooning other people, going off on a diatribe, kind of ranting, saying something that is relatable to some other part of the audience that isn't the Holocaust denial, that isn't the neo-Nazi content. And that's, that's where you see people get pulled in because they think like, oh, this clip, okay, he's funny here, right? And they're not seeing the rest of the stuff that's happening on the stream, they're seeing that. And this is where the other piece that happens with, the reason I describe it as you can't actually separate the influencer, the algorithm, and the crowd, which is why I try to explain it as a complex system. Because so much of what media looks for, in my opinion, one of the reasons why media oversimplifies these things is they're either writing about the terrible influencer, right, the big bad influencer who is, saying bad things, or they're writing about the algorithm, the tech platform that is doing that has a bad incentive and is showing you bad content. These things don't happen independently of each other. The influencer is creating content for the algorithm and the audience simultaneously at all times. Because the influencer who is profiting knows that they need to make content that the algorithm will surface. Anytime, if you've ever opened up YouTube and sort of scrolled, right, you search for something and you scroll, you'll notice that the thumbnails are remarkably similar looking. Somebody's face, big letters. That's not an accident, that's optimization, right? They're doing that because that is what the algorithm wants to curate.
And what's working particularly well right now, right? Whether it's Nick Fuentes or other personalities you might want to highlight as examples, kind of what at this moment in time, this combination of both the logic of the algorithm, but also just the kind of the mood, the primal, perhaps unarticulated desires of all of us, like what is doing well at this moment, and what does that say about us?
Well, and I think that's where the crowd component comes in, right? You do have, for a figure like Fuentes, or for some of the more like, the term is like based in the United States, I don't know if that translates here, but the people who are looking for something irreverent, somebody who is reflecting the dissatisfaction that they feel in real life. They're giving voice to that. They're doing it in a way that is entertaining and biting and has some like lift to it. If you look at what, particularly on the Democratic, the sort of left right now, people are really looking for that. They're looking for people who are pushing back, who are being aggressive. This is why Gavin Newsom has really fundamentally changed the way, this is the governor of California, the way he communicates. A respectable political figure talking like an online shitposter, right? And it's because the third part of that triad is the audience, because without the likes, without the shares, without the retweets, you're not communicating back to the algorithm that this is something worth amplifying. So these three things are always working in concert, and it is a reflection of where is the public's, id, so to speak, where is that demand, and who are the characters, the creators that are most adept at giving voice to that tone and that sentiment and that feeling that also understand what the algorithm is looking for.
Andrew, you raised the example of both Laura Loomer, someone who's now, if we actually did a full discussion or exposition of her views, and then at the end of that said this person is in the White House making personnel decisions, I think we'd all be shocked anew.
She's also the lead profile subject of the New Yorker this week.
That's true. Plug for the magazine. But also the kind of the generator of Pizzagate, also himself finding him invited to the White House. There's a temptation, I think, at least shared among some in this room, I certainly at times want to indulge in it, that there's something particularly that there's like a crazy confluence of circumstances at this moment in this White House, this administration, in American society, that like the fever has to break, that it is a fever, right? It's not a kind of new, it's not a kind of chronic condition, but it's actually something more acute that shall pass just almost by laws of biology. And that, in 4 years, 8 years, there won't be figures like Laura Loomer in the White House. That's something particular to this age. Do you believe that? And if not, explain why this is actually a kind of permanent feature of our culture and politics, and we should kind of get used to society and politics functioning in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be a fever without necessarily thinking that it will ever break. Like, I think you can have...
Sounds unpleasant.
Yeah. Well, imagine there were a planet that was just warming but it just kept warming, like hypothetically. Imagine that planet. There would be no law of the ecosystem on that planet that said, oh, this will have to stop because we would really like it to. You have to do things to make it stop. And so I think, climate is a useful metaphor. I like food metaphors. You're talking about people serving a market. When you're talking about serving a market, there's the aid of the consumer involved. There's the demand side and the supply side. And so you can invoke all these complex technological algorithmic tools to try to mitigate it. But at the end of the day, there is a demand for it. And when you mix politics into it, so like Renée was saying, the notion that there's something called online and offline politics has been anachronistic for a while. What that also forces us to reckon with is that there is no... like you were saying, good propaganda meets people where they are. There's no reason to think that if we hit the kill switch on the internet tomorrow, propaganda would disappear. I mean, the propaganda we were talking about in the New York mayoral race, I can tell you as a resident of New York, that propaganda was slipped through my mail slot on paper, right? There wasn't an algorithm doing it. It was just Airbnb paying for Cuomo mail to go out with Islamophobic stuff on it.
Yet ultimately, in that case, it looks like kind of Mamdani's very native, fluent sense of how to go viral on the internet was much more. I mean, it's a question of is the medium the message? Was it that he was better at going viral on the internet, or was it actually just that his message resonated with people more?
I think in any medium, he would have been the best politician in that race. Although Sliwa was pretty good at memifying himself, So I just raised that not to say that the internet doesn't matter. I mean, Mamdani's social videos were a hugely important part of the campaign, but he would have won that race if he were stumping like Fiorello LaGuardia too. And so I think that sometimes we put ourselves almost in this kind of internet exceptionalist mindset to say, now I get it, because I actually do think that you could make a case, and I don't want to retread 2016 trauma for anyone, but I do think that you can make a case that some elections are so close and the algorithms are so new and people haven't built up enough kind of resistance to the way they are working in their mental filters that they can have an outsized impact on an election or on a consumer choice or whatever. I think but that doesn't mean that the underlying conditions weren't there to be exploited in some other way. You mentioned Gavin Newsom. I just did a piece about kind of what happened to all the young men and why the shift in 18 to 29-year-old men from Biden to Trump was like this massive 30-point swing. And in that piece, I talk about it from an online influencer angle, and I spend a lot of time with Twitch streamers who run the gamut from far left socialists to far right white nationalists and kind of everywhere in between. And yet, I also think that you could say that there are material conditions that have to do with people's lives that you can't... I think where I start to worry is when we try to let ourselves off the hook as political elites, media elites, members of a society, and say, if only people weren't so duped by the algorithms, they wouldn't be mad that the price of milk is rising. And that's just actually not how politics works.
Renée, I want to ask your sense of, if and how the fever might break, or rather kind of how this dynamic might unfold going forward in a different political context, different political leaders, different political actors, right? How much will stay and how much will remain? And asking that in the context of an aphorism about essentially, if we don't have a shared set of facts, if we don't have a shared sense of reality of truth, we don't really have a democracy. Is there a reason to believe, right, that fundamental dynamic will change, can shift, or rather, maybe a better way of asking the question is, what is a leading and what is a lagging indicator? What's the cause and what's the effect, right? Like the democratic erosion, rise of a kind of hybrid liberalism that I want to talk about in a moment, is that a result of us losing this sense of a kind of shared factual reality, or the opposite, right? As our political systems erode and decay, does that then give rise to this kind of post-factual universe? I'm guessing the answer is a bit of both, but maybe you can just walk us through that dynamic.
I think it is a bit of both. I think it's that it's pulling more people in, which is, so my work is, I'm not a journalist, though I do write a lot, I contribute in a lot of places. What I did when I was at Stanford Internet Observatory, which doesn't exist anymore, was we would actually observe narratives that were happening during elections as they went viral. And one of the things that we were interested in was how did they go viral? And we began to use the term rumor because it was actually much more effective than misinformation, because rumors happen when you actually don't know if something is true or false yet, right? You hear something, you see something, somebody says, hey, there's a suitcase outside my polling place. Well, you can interpret that in a lot of different ways. If you are innately distrustful, you might say, like, that is how they are bringing in the ballots that they are going to use to stuff to get the result they want, right? And so this is, we would see these narratives going viral, and we would look at how did they break containment, basically, which were the ones that actually really went viral. Because sometimes people say something, they take a screenshot, and it goes nowhere. It just kind of continues to be low-level chatter. Turns out most of the time it's an influencer picking it up and saying, like, big if true. They don't want to actually commit themselves, or I should say they didn't want to actually commit themselves in 2020. 2020 was the time in the United States of big if true. 2022, they're like, this is how they're stealing it, man, right? It was so normalized by that point that you saw influencers on the right in particular willing to just like go, full bore for it. 2024, again, the same thing. Then you had some of the biggest influencers, Elon Musk, for example, willing to stand on stage and say, like, the voting machines were rigged in 2020, which was a thing that we actually litigated in our courts, which Fox News paid a massive settlement over, but for some reason Elon Musk was willing to, relitigate the lie. So it became so normalized over that period of time, this belief that the 2020 election was stolen, that it no longer was a fringe belief on the outside. It was something that had become so normalized that now you can just say it. Right, and that hasn't really happened on the left yet, but you have started to see it beginning to go in that direction. You started to see that happening a little bit in 2024 in particular, where when Trump won, you started to see on the left, oh, Starlink was involved somehow. Oh, and these rumors began to emerge, but they don't actually achieve that sort of critical mass yet on the left. There's no influencers who are willing to really stake their reputation on it, and there certainly are not political elites who are willing to really take that and make that a core part of a mainstream political party belief. They are still saying, no, this is not true, no, this did not happen, the election was free and fair. So you can see these dynamics, they're not uniformly distributed, and that's one of the real challenges, I think, that we contend with, which is you still have in-group policing of conspiracy theories happening around democratic issues on one side and not necessarily on the other. And I think for these very critical areas like elections, which relate to the sort of peaceful transfer of power, that's where we've started to see this shift, this normalization over time, where it is actually completely normal to reflexively say that was stolen if you don't like the outcome.
I've seen a few things, just to jump in on that, I've seen a few things just anecdotally. I'm not doing it from a formal observable way, where I have, again, just anecdotally seen a little bit more of kind of left low trust behavior.
It's increasing.
Right after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I saw a lot of conspiracy stuff on the left and the right. And I was sort of puzzling through why that might be now. And I think the most obvious answer to me is, we talk about kind of people who are low trust. It is not a stretch for me to look at Kash Patel investigating the murder of Charlie Kirk and have low trust in that environment, right? Because we live in a country where people are put in these jobs, like director of the FBI, not clearly because of experience or merit, but because of loyalty and cronyism. Why would I trust that environment? So, and actually in a way, like, we've been talking a lot about the kind of some of the low-hanging fruit of really dumb internet rumors. Like the one about the USAID was sending $50 million in condoms to Gaza. That was literally like Gaza province, Mozambique, that somebody misinterpreted as Gaza. Like, that's how dumb it is. But they're not all that dumb. Some of them are much more complicated. And some people, to talk about the, propaganda is latching onto something true, there are very good reasons to have low trust in a lot of American institutions. And this was true before Donald Trump. There were lots of reasons. I went to follow Tucker Carlson around on a Middle of America road show for a piece. And a lot of the stuff he was saying was, this place that I'm in has been left behind by bad trade deals. You're angry about this policy that let you down. You don't trust the institutions around you. You have no communal life. They brought in a Walmart, but they took out your church. And I would sit there for like 10 minutes and be like, this is all true, and this is all addressing something real. And then it would swerve into some kind of hate influencer territory about, scapegoating immigrants or something. But my point is, the low trust, the low trust coalition, the people who reflexively said, they must be doing it to me, that is not inherently left or right coded. That is a problem in societies when people get left behind, and there are always people who are left behind and are not given a good explanation for why.
Yet so far, and I want to ask you about both your experience on the road with Tucker Carlson, also this piece you wrote for The New Yorker about the manosphere and this idea of, like, can the left come up with a counter manosphere? Should it even? Why is it that in past years, the communicators who've done a better job or had a kind of more success in speaking to those voters, low trust, alienated voters, right? That those tend to be right-coded figures. Is it about the style of communication? Is it about the fundamental message? Like, why is it that
I think there has been a coalitional decision. I would love to hear your take on this, because I think that coalitions are emergent, right? The Democratic coalition is sort of, there's a head of it, right? But there's like a president but really what happens is there are these kind of emergent properties where people kind of collectively decide how to in-group sort of police norms. And like you were saying, there was a kind of right, far right, I mean, it's all just the right, basically, now, that there was very little social cost to be paid for throwing something out there and being wrong. The greater political cost was to go against Donald Trump when he said, you have to say the 2020 election was stolen. There was a clear cost to be paid for that. But if you said, I think there were a bunch of voting mules who, were whatever, and then later you have to backtrack, there's very little social cost to pay for that. It seems to me, and I would be curious if you see it this way, that the left, center-left coalition, there was almost an inverse effect where you're almost kind of have an in-group norm of not only not sounding too angry or lashing out at the systems that have left people behind, but also just like when they go low, we go high. We're going to be, civic discourse. We're going to keep the temperature nice and low. In fact, if you have worries about the president being too old, you probably shouldn't talk about it. Right. Like, let's
defenders of institutions also, right? Kind of very much being committed to a status quo defense of institutions as we've known them.
And so now people like Gavin Newsom, I think Gavin Newsom personally, is doing a pretty clunky job of it. He's trying, but I think, a lot of the other people, like people on Twitch and stuff, are doing, I think, a more authentically angry job because they have felt stifled for a long time, where they were saying Biden shouldn't run for re-election. They were saying, I have problems with the CDC, or whatever their thing is, but I don't want to then be a Trumpist Republican. We just want to
see something different.
I just want to be a leftist who has low trust in certain parts of our society, and they felt that was stifled for a long time.
Well, and I think that's where the idea of propaganda as having some connection to a real issue is 100% it, right? And it always has been, going back centuries, again, not unique to the internet. I think what I see, though, is the role of people who were institutional authorities or experts or elites, if you will, and I hate that term because I feel like it's become meaningless or too sort of exclusionary, populist coded at this point. But they were sort of the old fire break against the extreme conspiratorial explanation for the world, right? And the example I would give on this is, you remember, I don't know how many people, show of hands, heard the eating the pets story here. Did that make it here? Oh, there we go, yeah. American exports.
Rumors, not pets.
For those who didn't, eating the pets was a rumor that it was actually, in fact, a rumor, that is the correct term for it, that emerged in a Facebook group, a closed Facebook group in Springfield, Ohio, where a woman sincerely, deeply, truly believed that her neighbor's friend's daughter's cat had been eaten by Haitian immigrants. And she posted this warning to her fellow non-Haitian, sort of white members of the Springfield, Ohio community, saying, watch out for your pets because the Haitian immigrants are eating the pets. This was decontextualized, it was screenshotted, it was posted to Twitter, it went viral on Twitter. Somebody else said, see, I told you they were eating the ducks, but they're also eating the cats. And what winds up happening, this goes viral, this is around the time that Grok had just released image generation capabilities. All of a sudden, in the sort of realm of participation, a whole lot of people begin making images, absurdist images of Donald Trump rescuing ducks and cats. So this has like a participation element. Again, it's fun. I think people really need to understand just how fun this kind of participation is for the people who are doing it. It breaks up your day. You're making a meme. Maybe the president sees it. Maybe he retweets it. In fact, that's exactly what happens in a lot of these cases, right? Political influencers, members of the community with millions of followers, see the funny stuff and they retweet them. It's like a badge of honor to be recognized in this way. And then J.D. Vance, who's running he's the vice presidential candidate at the time, he's the senator from Ohio, instead of saying this isn't happening, he says the opposite. He says, I knew that there was something going on in Springfield. We've been hearing about this for so long. Where is our border czar? Where is Kamala Harris? Because she, of course, is the presidential candidate on the Democratic Party side. So again, instead of the fire break happening with literally the senator from Ohio saying, guys, this isn't happening, because bomb threats start getting called in, right? This leads to offline action.
And there also is a rumor, which genuinely I don't know if it's true or not, that when Trump brings this up in a presidential debate, the day before that, he was on his plane with Laura Loomer. And the rumor is that Laura Loomer was encouraging him to bring it up in the debate.
I hadn't heard that. So this is the sort of thing, though, where and it does come up in the presidential debate, and then you see this then becomes national news. Everybody's talking about this story. This is like a 2-week media cycle in the United States. And J.D. Vance eventually says in an interview, so what if I made up the story? So what if we make up stories? The point is it calls attention to the bigger story. And the bigger story here, this is, again, what we call propaganda, is who is America for? That is what they are actually debating. Immigrants and immigrants eating pets is not a thing that is actually happening. This is sort of a racist trope. The bigger story is who is America for? That is the propaganda. That's what they're actually talking about, immigration through that lens. But you have, instead of a political elite, member of literally a sitting senator, vice presidential candidate, saying this didn't happen, this isn't true. Instead, he embraces it and he pushes it along and he moves it further. And that's what I think is still the difference. We can talk all day long about the people of Springfield who are genuinely experiencing hardship in their communities across the gamut, but that's where I think that difference is. It's the incorporation of it into the core DNA of the party, and that's where I think you have that problem.
I think the mechanics of the coalition now are such that if he had poo-pooed it, he would have paid a political cost, and by fanning the flames, he did not.
Yeah. So I want to ask, start with you, Renee, and Andrew can jump in, to kind of riff or bring forward the story of Father Charles Coughlin, who you write about in your book, as I understood, a kind of allegory for the way that institutions, let's not use the word elite, but kind of established, whether political or civic institutions and figures can kind of rein in the worst impulses and actually have an effect. Father Coughlin went from someone who was listened to by millions in the 1930s, spreading effectively Nazi propaganda across America, to someone who was irrelevant in a matter of years because institutions decided to corral him. And I wonder if that's both, technologically is not possible, at least in the same way anymore, but also, given what we've been talking about, this very particular feature of the age in which we live in, which is anti-establishment, anti-elite, low trust, as Andrew was talking about, that in a way, it seems to me that an effort to kind of do the kind of Father Coughlin approach to a story like Springfield would have almost the reverse effect, because people are so primed. Any attempt for existing established institutions or figures to effectively police the bounds of speech, tell people that's not true or that's dangerous and therefore it shouldn't be allowed, would in effect only feed the fire, reconfirm people's impulses that they're being either patronized or manipulated, deprived in some way, that this kind of low trust environment would actually only deepen and worsen, and is there a way out of that?
Well, I think so. I don't think that Coughlin was dealt with by deplatforming in the way that you think, I think. So let me tell this story very briefly. So Father Coughlin was a Catholic priest who was a sort of the first mass media influencer, we might say, radio. This is the heyday of radio. He had about 30 million listeners at his peak at a time when the population of the United States was around 120 million people. So wildly popular, right? And he kind of moved down the path of fascism. Kind of began talking about Mussolini. Speaking positively about Hitler. Kristallnacht was the fault of the Jews. This was one of the sort of moments, really the linchpin moment, when that was one of these moments where the broadcasters was like, whoa, 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 we got to do something about this guy. FDR was the president in the United States. He did not want to intervene because he did not want to be seen as, they did not want the government to be intervening in the speech of a private individual, even over the radio. The broadcasters, so kind of the privately held broadcasters, began to try to figure out what do we do about the guy, right? So they go through a series of things that you might read as content moderation. So they begin to pre-clear his speeches. They ask him to, provide us your speeches, your Sunday address in advance. They have somebody go on after him to say, Father Coughlin lied to you about the following things, and they sort of lay out the things that he said that were not true. They eventually temporarily yank him, right? They give his slot to a different Catholic priest, different religious figure to speak in that time. His followers begin to protest, actually, censorship. They begin to protest outside of the broadcasting, kind of the radio stations. You can read the New York Times, they have the archives are online, you can read it. It's kind of a fascinating series of stories as they are doing this. He's sort of supporting the Christian Front, the sort of militia organization that's getting into skirmishes in New York City at the time. This is as the U.S. is heading into World War II. So it's a sort of a fascinating story in what is happening in this moment, and it's very akin to what is happening today in the debates about what happens when you have demagogues on social media. In part because it is the question of the backlash, actually, when you have these moderation moments, is do you call more attention to the speech by trying to silence it? So do you do better work by having people counter-speaking? And one of the things that happens is there's a group called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis that forms a bunch of academics and civil society figures, where they start actually producing these pamphlets where they try to teach people to just recognize the tropes of propaganda. They decide that it's actually pointless to fact-check the guy because they're like, then you're sitting there playing whack-a-mole with this claim, that fact, this thing that he says. And instead they start producing materials where they basically say, like, when somebody says the word they, this is a red flag. And they start trying to teach people to recognize propaganda at a level higher than the individual claims, rather at the rhetorical level. And they begin distributing this content. These pamphlets, by the way, are fantastic. If you look at them, they actually make they look like emoji. It's kind of extraordinary. I pulled up the archives and I was like, wow, like, why don't we do this? Where they're just trying to annotate for people. This is what you should be paying attention to. This is the rhetoric. Here's how it works. Those guys wind up getting caught up in the Red Scare, right? That's how they're silenced. They're eventually defunded by Columbia and fired and kicked out for being communists. But what winds up happening is the thing that actually gets Coughlin off the radio, it's sort of two things. The Catholic Church says, enough, you're done. It's the bishops, it's the in-group policing that is what actually has the greatest impact. That is what really does it. It is the church leadership saying what you're doing is counterproductive, what you're doing is hurting people. And then the second thing is when the U.S. actually moves into World War II, they revoke his second-class mailing privileges because they allege that he is producing propaganda that is harmful to the war effort. And so that's the second piece of what happens. And so it's the combination of basically them making it very, very expensive, them raising the cost to distribute propaganda, but the most important thing was really the church coming in and saying, you're done. So it's the in-group policing, and that, I think, is the gap right now, because when you talk about Nick Fuentes, and going back to connecting it to what's happening now, there is a sort of war going on, maybe you want to describe it, in American conservatism right now about, what do you do about that? And I think that question of where is the in-group policing, when J.D. Vance chose to go along with eating the pets because the cost of pushing back was worse than the cost of pushing it along, that question of what does the in-group policing look like, I think becomes the kind of the question of our time.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, actually, in a kind of unanticipated way, I think the thing that has put pressure on both the left and right coalition in new ways to think about in-group policing actually has been post-October 7th. That the way that both coalitions talk about Israel, this is what Tucker and Fuentes are talking about for most of their 2.5 hours, and this has happened on the Democratic side as well. A lot of the Twitch streamers who I talked about, one of the ones who I wrote about as kind of, you know, lots of chatter about, is this guy going to be the Joe Rogan of the left? Is he going to be the future of the left? He went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and tweeted some very, very spicy things about Israel, and they kicked him out of the... So there's the reshuffling of how the in-group policing is working, right? After Tucker Carlson platforms Nick Fuentes, you have the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts coming out and saying, this is what we should be doing, we don't cancel people, we don't deplatform people. And then you have the Republican Jewish Coalition, or the Republican Jewish, whatever they're called, asking him to apologize, and Ted Cruz and all these people who are aligned with them, right? So it's creating these new cleavages. I guess, you know, I take the point of the in-group policing. The Catholic Church obviously is a much more hierarchical, not everyone has a Catholic Church, right? There is no Pope of the internet. So, so that's a kind of built-in hierarchical system that you don't have in most cases. And also, I am not going to fully play the role of libertarian free speech absolutist here, because I'm not one, but, you know, obviously, as you know, there are also costs to certainly any kind of government, you know, any kind of government action, like changing the class of your mail or whatever, has reverberating effects, as you say. Then we get the Red Scare, and then now we get, you know, Donald Trump's FCC jawboning Jimmy Kimmel off the air, right? So that is playing with fire. And so I don't want, like, I think everybody knows the kind of trade-offs and the counter-censorship arguments, but I don't want to leave us in a place of, like, what's the best way to censor our way out of the problem, because that never, yeah, it doesn't work.
A last question or two from me. If you haven't sent in a question and you want to, now is your moment to do so. I have them all here on this tablet, and I'll start reading them in a moment. I promised to myself and the audience, Andrew, that we'd get back to this idea of kind of hybrid regimes, a subject I'm very interested in. Essentially, you know, fading democracies that retain some of the features, or at least formal institutions that once made them democracies, but increasingly are de facto run like authoritarian.
Yeah, again, sounds like an interesting hypothetical.
Systems, yeah. Where have we seen that before or now? Maybe a better way of asking this question is to just have us do a little bit borrowed from the New Yorker Radio Hour, where you have a regular segment called How Bad Is It? So maybe we'll just do tonight's version of How Bad Is It? So tell us, both, you know, I'm struggling to think of a better way of asking the question than exactly that one. But tell us kind of where, in your own personal read, America is on this spectrum of a hybrid regime, but particularly maybe highlighting the context of media, information, kind of the civic and political space around what people think to be true, how they share that information. Where are we?
Yeah. So in the journalist part of me that just sort of like cites people and quotes people, I'll start by saying that, you know, Stephen Levitsky, Daniel Ziblatt, Lucan Way, the kind of political scientists who invented the term competitive authoritarianism, which is kind of a synonym for hybrid regimes. Basically, it's not fully democratic, it's not fully totalitarian. They have kind of stated that the United States is currently not a democracy. And so that the United States is currently an authoritarian country, but it's not fully totalitarian. It's by their reckoning, it's not fully a consolidated.
Why? I mean, we may all think we know the reasons, but perhaps you could just give us the ones that are most convincing to you, the factors that they cite that resonate with you.
Well, in a way, I mean, it's kind of your fault, Germany, because everyone always thinks about this as the Platonic ideal case, right? Everybody's running around saying, is it Kristallnacht? Is it 1938? Is it 1939? And what a lot of this research is trying to do is get people out of that frame as their exclusive historical touch point, and to say it doesn't have to involve a genocidal war, it doesn't have to involve camps, it doesn't have to involve the sort of full dystopian movie you have in your head. It can involve a life where you can go to JFK Airport and take a nice flight to Europe, and yes, I disabled facial recognition on my phone because I wasn't sure if I was going to get searched in the airport, but I didn't. And
well, this sounds incredibly familiar. I lived in Russia for 10 years and had actually a remarkably wonderful life, even as all around me the country was descending into a much harder authoritarianism than we're seeing or likely to see. But anyway, go on.
So the kind of future is here, but it's unevenly distributed. That's one feature of it. Another feature of it, as you were asking in the kind of civic society media context, is that you have all these kind of ambiguous kind of warning shots such that, and this also was true in Russia in 2000, and it was true in Hungary in 2010, and it was true in Brazil to some extent under Bolsonaro, and you have these, there's this constant ambiguity about where the lines actually are, right? You don't have a government issuing a decree saying, henceforth you shall not be able to say DEI on television, or if you talk about trans issues, your funding will be pulled, right? You have individual instances of speech being chilled. You have individual people being fired from their jobs, but with this kind of plausible deniability so that you don't know where the lines are. And you might be okay, but your neighbor might not, and vice versa. And more vulnerable people get hit earlier. So there's this feature of not actually knowing where you are on any given day. I mean, and there's a sort of feature of human psychology that I can sometimes fall into of kind of saying, okay, if this bad thing happened, then all these other 20 bad things must happen too, right? But you actually read the newspaper and you go, okay, if the Supreme Court is rubber stamping all these things that Donald Trump is doing, then probably they'll go argue about tariffs and they'll just let him do whatever he wants, and it turns out they're actually asking him a lot of tough questions about that particular case. If they're asked to overturn gay marriage, they just said no to that today. So it's not, this is the hybrid thing. It's not, okay, we're just going to rack up as many autocratic points as we can and put a bunch of points on the board. It's a little more haphazard and a little more unpredictable.
And I think scrambles the question, and maybe a piece you wrote for The New Yorker actually had this title or something like it, of like, will it happen here?
Is it happening?
Suggests a kind of a false binary. It's not that you live in a democracy and the next day it's an autocracy and you'll actually understand that transition. It's actually what we're living in it is happening. This is it. This is what it looks like to live inside of that transition.
I again think climate change is a good analogy, right? What would it look like to live on a planet undergoing a massive ecological catastrophe day by day? It would look like this.
To your point about will people leave freaked out or not, I think we're answering that question an hour in.
This should not be news to you, right? That's actually our life, but because of how we adapt as human beings, we have to adapt to it. We have to sleep at night, and so you just go to sleep at night even though you're living through a catastrophe.
Or one of my favorite, in a way, most telling stories of my time from Russia is that a friend of mine, grandmother, who's now sadly passed away, but said that 1937, the year, the most kind of intense, violent, bloody year of the Stalin purges, was actually the happiest year of her life, which she remembers is the year she fell in love and met the man she married, and they spent evenings, walking the embankment, arm in arm, taking strolls, and that was her 1937. I think that's actually most people's 1937, quote unquote, right? And I think history leads us to think that it's nothing but kind of terror, violence, and all the rest, when actually life continues for most people, as it does for us right now. Some questions from the audience, a few about regulation, a kind of big picture regulation question about should efforts be directed more at the level of social media companies, right? Kind of either constraining what they can or can't do or operate, or more, Renee, you mentioned this, essentially kind of civic education, civic literacy. Should it be more directed at society so people understand, what they're seeing and how to navigate this information? A few more specific questions about regulation. The use of AI. Could AI somehow be a tool that would help people identify when they're encountering information online, true, false? Another question brings up the precedent of tobacco companies. Are there some lessons from that history? Either of you jump in where you like.
So regulation is very different in the U.S. versus here. Here you all have the Digital Services Act. There's I have many thoughts on it as an American. But, in part because, also not an absolutist myself, but we generally don't want the government having regulatory authority over the moderation rules of social media platforms, in part because that means that, for example, Donald Trump would have that authority, right? And so governing what the day-to-day adjudication of what platforms allow or do not allow, I think, is not where we want our government to be. And where I think regulation should focus is instead on things like transparency. This is one of the things I like about the Digital Services Act. Researchers having access to data that lets people have a better understanding of how algorithmic curation and amplification works. When you see studies that come out saying that there's significant shifts in the type of content that people see or responses to polarization, these kinds of things, a lot of that work is done, for many years it was done because of voluntary goodwill by the platforms. They voluntarily made those data sets available. Twitter had an open API for many, many years, actually, that we used when I was at Stanford, and then they simply shut it down when Elon bought it and decided he didn't want it to be open anymore. And Meta rolled back some of its openness. You just don't see that kind of proactive disclosure anymore. That's where I think regulation is quite helpful for helping people understand the negative downstream impacts. If you want to make that comparison to tobacco, actually, it is sort of like saying, instead of the Merchants of Doubt, Naomi Oreskes has this fantastic book if you want to read about how tobacco companies tried to skew the science by arguing, by kind of putting out their own science. You want to make sure that independent researchers can, in fact, look under the hood at how social media does impact society, and that's where I think transparency regulation is kind of actually where those efforts should be spent, not in adjudicating the specific types of speech or the kind of content moderation that actually appears on social media platforms.
Anything you want to add, Andrew, about regulation?
I have no regulation that will solve it. I have no... this is always the question that I get that I have no good answer to, so that's why you're here.
A question about echo chambers, which I'll ask also because it allows me to lead with another story from Russia, which I found enlightening or amusing. And this one comes from right after the invasion in 2022, and I was speaking with the director of talk about hybrid regimes. Even in Putin's Russia, 26 years in, there's an element of hybridity in that there is an independent polling and sociological research agency that's still functioning, that does really good, independent, truthful polling about social attitudes and also focus groups. And the director of that was telling me about a focus group in a provincial city, not Moscow, right after the invasion, just asking people about their attitudes about the war. And there was a woman who said something to the effect of, I know that if I were, for example, to get my news about what's going on in Ukraine from the BBC Russian service, I would have a very different attitude, understanding of the war, maybe even a different attitude toward the country I live in. And that's why I don't watch the BBC Russian service. And I thought that she, talk about saying the quiet part out loud, revealed something profound about how, maybe in smaller ways, all of us operate. And so the question we got about echo chambers, right? Is there a way around that all the regulation in the world, can't fix this issue that, this woman from a provincial city in Russia highlighted, which is people, seeking out the information that either feels good to them, makes them feel safe, right? I think in the context of this woman doesn't sort of force them into some existential friction or crisis that's going to be uncomfortable for them. Who wants to live in that? So question about echo chambers, and are they actually surmountable?
I mean, I think there's a lot, sort of similar to the parts of our human psychology that want to sleep at night and wake up in the morning and feel okay. There are also a lot of social pressures that redound toward, that kind of make us very averse to certain kinds of social friction. And I even think, you know, you asked about, you know, media, communication stuff, but I did a story about, you know, we talked before about the Biden thing. Why was it so hard for the Democrats to come to the realization that Biden had to be replaced on the ticket? And I did a whole story trying to report out why that was. And a lot of it had to do with these kind of in-group social mores that, you know, I think the more hybrid regime, autocratic version would be, you know, if Joe Biden was going around saying, you know, I'm going to kneecap you and, you know, threaten your children if you know. It wasn't that. It was, there's a hierarchy here. Some of it is spoken, some of it's unspoken. And there's just norms and things that you don't do, right? We love talking about the nice norms that uphold our electoral system and uphold our society, but norms do all kinds of things. And one thing they do is make it hard to talk about certain things, even if they're staring you in the face. And so I think that happens with echo chambers of all kinds, right? It happens with people don't want to say something heterodox within their own group and get yelled at. People don't want to, you know, have a rough night. People also don't always know what's true. I mean, one of the most obvious things, so obvious that it barely even needs to be said, right, is that one of the things that our attentional marketplace rewards, both algorithmically and also just from a pure, you know, raw numbers point of view, is confidence and having a clear take. And so if your take is, I think it's really complicated, and like, I think the CDC did its best, but it really messed up a lot of stuff, and I don't know, like, it was kind of, seemed like it was aerosolized for a long time, but they didn't really talk about it. Like, there's no real natural political home for you with that take. There's no natural attentional home for you with that take. That's like a one-on-one dinner companion take. That's not a social media take. And that's a systemic problem, because if that's your actual opinion and there's nowhere for you to go to voice it, then you're not really, like, honestly participating in any kind of public discourse.
A good question here that picks up on something we talked about, which is countermeasures to either kind of provide, to kind of fight speech with more speech, right, as you talked about, Renée, but also in finding ways where that speech is particularly harmful, dangerous, wrong, to limit it, whether that's on the level of corporation, government. Essentially a question about, you know, what is the right limit, what's the balance. Andrew mentioned being wary or kind of cognizant of not slipping into territory where you're actually creating a precedent you'll regret later. I don't know if this is maybe more coming from me than the question on the screen, but, you know, have been tendencies in recent years for a certain illiberalism, censoriousness on the left, right, around policing speech. Has that kind of fed into a much more dramatic and kind of state-led effort on the right? How do you see these dynamics? How do you see finding the right balance? Where do you place this very kind of subtle and difficult to calibrate line between protecting society, protecting discourse, but also not being counterproductive in the long term?
I think it's a really hard question. I don't think that I don't think that there's a obvious answer or a right answer on that. So in 2020, for example, with election rumors, platforms came up with a set of policies, saying that we don't want to allow viral claims that delegitimize the election on our platform, basically saying we don't want speech on there that says that the election is fraudulent. Now, moderation isn't a binary. That doesn't mean that they came down. In fact, most of the time, they did not come down at all. They put up a little label, and it just said, for more information about the mail-in ballots, click here. And it would take you to a little info center. And in the info center, you could learn about mail-in ballots. You could learn about the fact that mail-in ballot fraud is actually extraordinarily low, right? So if you were reading, for example, a tweet by President Trump, which Twitter labeled a couple times the president's tweets, you could then go and find out the information about mail-in ballots. But labels were recast, reframed as censorship by the people who said that the election was stolen, because any sort of intervention, anything that imposed any sort of friction whatsoever or cast doubt on that speech was reframed as censorship. So any sort of counter speech, I see a label as counter speech. That is the platform saying, for more information, go here. That's your speech, here's my speech, go over here. Fact checks were reframed as censorship. And then the other thing that a platform can do is they can also throttle it. They can reduce it from distribution. And this was another thing that happened. During COVID, if you look at Twitter's transparency data, it says that it only took down about 9,000 tweets during all of COVID. And that what it was doing the rest of the time was primarily throttling and labeling. Again, for more information, go here. And it would direct you to the CDC, it would direct you to the other places. Was it a good policy? I don't know. I mean, one of the things that is very challenging is what is the counterfactual? What should they have done? I think there are certain areas where, for example, like the lab leak hypothesis is kind of the notorious, a rather notorious one. The lab leak hypothesis, I don't think really caused any harm. I don't think that this is a policy where if you believed that or if you said it or if you debated it, it caused any particular type of harm, as opposed to things like this fake cure, that vaccine commentary. Like there were certain things where you could make a plausible argument about delegitimization of an election leading to violence, leading to political violence, which it turned out it did, or claims about public health leading to certain types of actions that led to downstream harms. But then there were certain areas where it seemed like they overstepped. On the flip side, though, it turned out that when you actually looked at who created those policies around labeling or addressing lab leak content, it was really just Meta for about 3 months. YouTube chose not to do that. They didn't have that policy. Twitter chose not to do that. They didn't have that policy. So there's also like a huge spectrum in content moderation by platform, because these are private companies. And the platform has its own First Amendment rights in the United States to make those determinations as a private company. And that's where I also think that what we should want to see is a proliferation of platforms with their own rules where people can choose to go and speak in these various different ways on those platforms in accordance with the rules that have been set. I think that's really the only thing that you can get to. I know that this does not satisfy very many people, but I think you want to see a spectrum of moderation in accordance with the potential for actual downstream harm with a variety of different places that people can go, because there was never at any moment in time during the pandemic a time when you could not get that information somewhere. And that, I think, is the important thing that we have to be aware of.
Andrew, anything you want to pick up there about either lab leak hypothesis that was made kind of anathema by many quarters?
Look at the DNA of a pangolin. You notice? No, I'm just kidding.
And just to be clear, I thought that was such a stupid
generally,
policy.
Is there anything to be learned from? And you mentioned this about the whole debate around Biden's age. Like, is there anything to be learned from moments in which the left was kind of policing speech in a way that turned out to be counterproductive because it exposed them to these claims of this kind of pretentious censoriousness? We know better.
So it's a few things. I mean, it is a vexing thing as a reporter when you go out into the world and people keep telling you this thing that you don't want to be true, and yet you have to reckon with it being true. So one thing that people kept telling me was, you guys are really, really annoying, and the whole country hates you. And you guys could be, the media, people who dress like this, people who talk into microphones like this. It could be you could define it as broadly as you want. But I kept saying, you shouldn't resent me. You should resent, who cancels more people than Donald Trump? Who's more of a threat to free speech than Donald Trump? I kept saying all these things that I still think are true. And by the way, I still think it's true that Donald Trump won in part by being the champion for letting people say what they want, and is literally arresting and deporting people for writing words in a newspaper. That is true. There is no greater threat to free speech in America than the Trump administration. And yet, it is still also true as a reporter that when I went out and talked to people, especially young online men, they would say, you're censorious, you're annoying, you're the problem. I was like, I never did anything to you, buddy. But there is that perception that still exists, and I just had to figure out some way to reckon with it. And so I guess the way I square that stuff is to say...
But does that perception exist for a reason? And if there is you don't have to in its entirety embrace it, right? But if you find some kernel of truth or something you want to engage with there, then what do you do? How do you?
There's absolutely
how does it affect your work?
I'm annoyed by myself. I understand the impulse. I definitely.
I find you quite pleasant. So.
I understand what's annoying about smug media elites. I really do, and I also do think that there is that you leave open a space for sort of really dark, festering energy if you refuse to acknowledge that there is some control happening. So now, like, I work at a media company. I know that we're not as powerful as people make us out to be. I also know that to the extent that there was 3 months of throttling the lab leak or whatever, Meta is not the liberal elites, right? That's, right? So I know all these things to be true, and yet there is a kernel of a thing out there in the world where people say, and let's just take the case of, 18 to 29-year-old men, you're kind of classic, extremely online, bro American voter who wants to feel part of this parasocial world where I can be included in some kind of conversation and not feel like I'm not welcome. So if you go to, pick your kind of, legacy-approved traditional media channel, it's going to feel hemmed in because those things are edited and they're pre-cleared and there's lots of people looking at them and fact-checking them. And then you go listen to Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn, be like, could you Google that, Jamie? That sounds really interesting. That is a more loose hang parasocially. And there is something to that. And the thrill of kind of forbidden knowledge, being able to say things whether or not they're true, that is a real thing. And I know from having listened to thousands of hours of Joe Rogan that there is a parasocial thing there that is real.
I want to get a few, absolutely, and we're going to ask a last question after that.
Yeah, and I think that's very valid. See, the problem with the whole lab leak thing also, which I thought was a really stupid policy, and I said this regularly, it was actually that it reflected the fact that the institutions didn't feel like they had to engage. And that's the other piece of it. It was like and I wrote about this for The Atlantic at the time too. It was just the sense that the CDC didn't have to deign to give the public a conversation about this. And that's where you get this sense of like, the elites don't talk to us, but you can listen to it on Rogan or Vaughn. And that's where the conversation is happening, even as the elites don't talk. And that's the gap. And that's why I was like, just constantly writing about how the institutionalists were not participating in the public conversation where the people were. And that was, I think, the big egregious communication failure during COVID.
I'm going to try to pull together a few online questions and add one of my own as a last question for both of you. It's in a way to finish where we started, which is you wrote these books that turned out to have a kind of dark prescience for how politics and society would function. As people who are, I agree with the thesis that the online and offline worlds have collapsed, and there's not much of a distinction, but Renée, you yourself admitted that, I think as you put it, you're very online. I think you two both actually are a bit kind of deeper into some of these worlds and subcultures than I am and many people in the audience. So kind of tell us...
We're online right now.
Yeah, that's true. So tell us where we're headed. In other words, rather than kind of, which has been useful and very illustrative tonight, to go back and kind of analyze with the hindsight of history some events and moments from the recent past, what's coming? What are you seeing in terms of how people communicate online? What types of communicators are rising, are in demand right now? What kind of messages? What are the dynamics? What are the subcultures? Who's kind of at the tip of the spear online that we're in 2 years, 3 years, or maybe 6 months, given the speed of things, could be sitting on a stage discussing, but we're not yet? Can it give us a sneak preview of the future and how what's coming from online that's soon going to be in all of our lives, and how we relate to each other, think about politics, and all the rest?
My article that hopefully will be out tomorrow is about Grokpedia. It's with the Atlantic fact checkers now because they fact check mainstream media.
How outmoded?
Yeah. Sneak preview. No. It's actually about I think that it's about the litigation of facts and who writes them and who shapes them, and the war with Wikipedia that I find so fascinating. The reason I wanted to write this story is about, so the fight's about content moderation. The term is working the referees, right? Can you get the referee to go in your direction, right? Can you make social media platforms moderate completely differently by saying, like, those rules aren't fair, they're biased against me? Turns out, yes, that's a very effective way to get platforms to change the rules. What we're seeing with Wikipedia now is that same argument, but at the level of facts. Can you say that this source is fundamentally against me, ergo that shouldn't be a legitimate source? This is what Grokpedia is, essentially. It is the creation of an entirely alternate knowledge base that is intended to compete with Wikipedia as human-created consensus knowledge is coming under attack. And now we're seeing the idea that since AI can produce content, since it can write this way, since it can synthesize and it hallucinates a bit, but since it can increasingly synthesize ideas, this question of what is a reputable source, like we're really at this point litigating the very idea of what is a fact and what is consensus, and to what extent do we need humans to be part of that process. And this is really going to have some fundamental, pretty profound downstream effects as answer engines are increasingly synthesizing information for us. And so that is a big area of my research right now, and also where I think the kind of current fight for reality is.
Mm-hmm. I think it's all going to be totally fine, and everything will, whoever your person is, will just be president next, and they'll fix everything. No, I'm just kidding. Our next president will be AI slop Jake Paul, and I think that the war over fact, it's a very old war, and it's now automated, and so it's speeding up. But I don't think that's going away. I mean, when I was like sort of full-time in these worlds, a lot of my subjects or sources would kind of try to get me on my back foot by being like, you know that you're the dinosaur media, and we're surpassing you, and we're replacing you. And I was like, I know, that's why I'm here with you. That's what I'm interested in. So I don't think that we can wish that away or be so gated and institutionalist that we just, guardrail it away from happening. It is happening. And I don't think that the response to that is to just chase the algorithmic incentives and seek out the highest audience. Obviously, I don't think that. But I think you have to be aware of the empirical fact that the attentional marketplace is shifting. And so I think it's an invitation to try to introspect a little bit about why you value the things you value. And it actually is useful to be like, do I think Wikipedia is better than Grokpedia? Do I think that, Reuters is better than Breitbart? Do I think, actually take stock of it? And to the extent that you do find value in those things, it's actually a really good opportunity to not take them for granted and to try to think about how to revivify them rather than simply just expecting them to always go on.
I'll take that as a very subtle and hopefully successful subscription pitch for the New Yorker.
Embedded that's in the main one that you should value.
Yeah.
The most fact checkers in the business, baby.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you both. I don't know if this was a feel-good evening, but it certainly was a very interesting and enlightening one. Thank you to you all for giving us your attentional abilities, or the attention economy was here in this room tonight, and we're all grateful for that. Thanks to Renee, Andrew, and to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would have sort of liked to stop when you said it's all going to be fine. But I don't cut the live stream, right? So our guests have graciously accepted to sign books in the foyer tonight. So can I ask you all not to come up to the stage when it's over? We need to get out into the foyer, and they will be there at tables. We have books, and they will sign as for a bit of time before we go up to the reception. I can highly recommend both books. We have them out there. And I would also like to encourage you to follow the amerikahaus website going forward into the holiday season, because they have lots of really wonderful events, not all that have to do with politics, that I think you might enjoy. And if you want to know what we're doing next and you're not on our mailing list, go to dialoguesondemocracy.com and you can just sign up to get our emails, and we will let you know. The next one is next month. So thank you all for coming and engaging. Thank you for being a part of this community, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.